Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address what I believe is one of the most consequential economic developments unfolding in the North American trade landscape today. What we are witnessing between the United States and Canada is not merely a political disagreement between two heads of state. It is not a diplomatic spat that will resolve itself over a phone call or a weekend summit. What we are observing with increasing clarity and with mounting economic data to support that observation is a fundamental restructuring of trade relationships that have defined North American economic integration for more than 3 decades. And I want to be very precise about what that means, because precision matters enormously when we are talking about supply chains, commodity flows, labor markets, and the long term fiscal health of both nations involved. Let me begin with the claim that has been circulating in political discourse: the assertion that Canada is desperate. That Canada, facing the weight of American tariffs and trade pressure, would inevitably return to the negotiating table on terms favorable to Washington. That Canada's economy, deeply integrated with the United States through the framework of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, would have no viable alternative but to absorb whatever conditions were placed before it. I have heard this argument made with considerable confidence in certain political circles, and I want to address it directly as an economist, as someone who has spent decades studying trade dynamics, capital flows, and the behavioral responses of sovereign economies under external pressure. The argument is not supported by the data. It was not supported by the data when it was first made, and it is even less supported now. The announcement of $4.7 billion in new trade deals by the Canadian government under Prime Minister Mark Carney represents something far more significant than a headline number. To understand why, you have to understand the architecture of how trade relationships are built, sustained, and redirected. Trade agreements of this scale do not emerge overnight. They are the product of months, sometimes years, of diplomatic groundwork, economic modeling, legal negotiation, and market preparation. The fact that Canada has been able to announce deals of this magnitude within the current timeline tells us something very important. It tells us that Canada began preparing for this scenario well before the pressure was publicly applied. That is not the behavior of a desperate economy. That is the behavior of a strategically prepared one. I want to place this $4.7 billion figure in its proper economic context, because numbers without context are simply noise. Canada's total merchandise trade in a given year runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Its trade relationship with the United States alone accounts for approximately $700 billion annually in two-way trade flows. So $4.7 billion taken in isolation might appear modest, but that is the wrong frame entirely. The correct frame is not the absolute size of the number relative to Canada's total trade volume. The correct frame is what this number signals about directional momentum. In economics, we talk frequently about signaling, the way in which actions by governments, central banks, and market participants communicate intentions and capabilities that then shape the expectations and behaviors of other actors. The $4.7 billion in new trade deals is, above all else, a signal. It signals to European partners, to Asian markets, to global commodity buyers, and to international investors that Canada is not waiting. Canada is moving. Now, let us examine what is happening on the American side of this equation, because I think it is essential to be honest about the economic consequences of the posture that has been adopted toward Canada. The United States and Canada share one of the most deeply integrated economic relationships in the history of international trade. This is not hyperbole. It is a structural reality that took decades to construct and that touches virtually every sector of the American economy. Canadian energy, oil, natural gas, hydroelectric power flows into American homes, factories, and refineries every single day. Canadian steel and aluminum are embedded in American manufacturing supply chains in ways that cannot be easily or quickly replaced. Canadian agricultural products, from potash that fertilizes American farmland to dairy and grain products, are woven into the fabric of American food production and distribution. When political rhetoric characterizes Canada as desperate, it obscures a more uncomfortable truth, that the interdependencies in this relationship run in both directions, and in some critical sectors, they run more heavily toward American dependency than Canadian dependency. I say this not to be provocative, but because sound economic policy requires an accurate assessment of leverage and vulnerability. And an accurate assessment reveals that the United States has significant exposure in this relationship that is not always acknowledged in the public discourse surrounding these trade tensions. Consider the energy sector specifically, because it is illustrative of the broader dynamic. The United States imports a substantial volume of Canadian crude oil, particularly heavy crude, that is specifically suited to the refinery configurations of the American Midwest and Gulf Coast. These refineries were built, over decades, with the explicit expectation of processing Canadian crude. They are not easily converted to process different grades of oil on short notice. The capital investment required to reconfigure a major refinery runs into the billions of dollars and takes years to execute. So when trade tensions introduce uncertainty into the reliability of Canadian energy flows, the immediate and practical consequence is not that American refineries pivot smoothly to alternative suppliers. The immediate consequence is uncertainty, operational risk, and upward pressure on energy costs that ultimately flow through to American consumers and American businesses. This is the economic reality that gets lost when the conversation is framed purely in terms of political leverage and national pride. Trade relationships of the depth and complexity that exist between the United States and Canada are not instruments that can be wielded without consequence to both parties. They are systems, deeply interconnected, mutually dependent systems. And when you introduce significant friction into a system of that nature, the friction does not stay neatly contained on one side. It propagates. It distributes itself across the system in ways that are sometimes difficult to predict and even more difficult to reverse. I want to turn now to Mark Carney specifically, because I think his background and his response to this moment deserve careful analysis. Prime Minister Carney comes to political leadership with an unusual depth of economic and financial expertise. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 global financial crisis, a period that tested the judgment and institutional resilience of central bankers around the world. He then served as governor of the Bank of England, navigating that institution and the broader British economy through the extraordinary complexity of Brexit and its associated economic dislocations. These are not credentials that produce a leader who panics under pressure. These are credentials that produce a leader who understands at a deep institutional level how to read economic signals, how to manage market expectations, and how to make strategic decisions under conditions of significant uncertainty. The $4.7 billion in trade deals is, in my professional assessment, a direct reflection of that background. It reflects a leader who understood early that the correct response to trade pressure was not rhetorical escalation alone, but concrete economic repositioning. The deals themselves, spanning European partners, Asian markets, and emerging economy buyers, represent a deliberate effort to reduce Canada's trade concentration risk. In portfolio theory, we talk about the dangers of over-concentration, of having too much exposure to a single asset, a single market, a single counterparty. Canada's trade relationship with the United States, while enormously valuable, also represented a form of concentration risk. The current moment, as disruptive as it is accelerating a diversification process that many Canadian economists had been advocating for years. What Prime Minister Carney has done, in effect, is transform an external shock into a strategic catalyst. That is sophisticated economic governance. And the market response, the fact that $4.7 billion in deals has been secured, that trading partners are willing and eager to deepen their relationships with Canada, suggests that the international economic community shares this assessment of Canada's fundamental economic strength and strategic reliability as a trade partner. I want to close this first section by addressing the broader global context in which these developments are unfolding, because no bilateral trade dispute exists in isolation. We are living through a period of significant global economic realignment. The supply chain disruptions of the pandemic era, the inflationary pressures of 2021 through 2023, the geopolitical dislocations associated with the war in Ukraine, and the ongoing strategic competition between the United States and China have collectively produced a global environment in which governments and corporations alike are reassessing their trade dependencies and their supply chain vulnerabilities. In this environment, Canada's natural resource endowments, its stable institutional framework, its skilled workforce, and its geographic positioning make it an extraordinarily attractive partner for economies around the world that are seeking reliable, democratic, rule of law based alternatives to more volatile supply relationships. The $4.7 billion is the beginning of a number that will grow. That is my assessment as an economist. And as that number grows, the characterization of Canada as desperate will become increasingly difficult to sustain, not because of political argument, but because of economic fact. I would like to begin this section by examining something that rarely receives the attention it deserves in public discussions of trade policy: the difference between short-term political leverage and long-term structural economic power. These are not the same thing, and conflating them leads to policy decisions that appear strong in the immediate term but generate significant economic costs over the medium and long term. This distinction is, in my view, absolutely central to understanding what is happening between the United States and Canada right now, and why the trajectory of this dispute carries implications that extend well beyond the bilateral relationship itself. Short-term political leverage is relatively easy to identify and relatively easy to deploy. It derives from the ability to impose immediate costs on a trading partner: tariffs that raise the price of imported goods, regulatory barriers that slow the flow of products across borders, or rhetorical pressure designed to create uncertainty in financial markets and business planning environments. These tools can produce visible, measurable effects in the short run. They can slow trade flows, disrupt supply chains, and create negotiating pressure. Governments throughout history have used them, and they can be effective instruments under specific conditions, particularly when the target economy has limited alternatives and when the costs of resistance exceed the costs of compliance. But long-term structural economic power is a different matter entirely. It derives not from the ability to impose short-term costs, but from the underlying characteristics of an economy: its resource endowments, its institutional quality, its human capital, its technological capabilities, its geographic positioning, and critically, its reputation as a reliable and stable partner in the international economic system. Long-term structural power is what determines whether, when the immediate pressure of a trade dispute dissipates, an economy emerges stronger or weaker, whether it has used the period of disruption to build new relationships and capabilities, or whether it has simply waited for the pressure to ease. Canada, by every structural measure I would apply as an economist, possesses long-term economic power that is substantially underappreciated in the current political discourse. Let me enumerate these structural advantages with the specificity they deserve, because I think the public conversation has been too dominated by political framing and too little informed by economic fundamentals. Begin with natural resources, because they remain foundational to global economic activity despite the technological sophistication of modern economies. Canada possesses the third largest proven oil reserves in the world. It is the world's largest producer of potash, the essential mineral component of fertilizers that feed the global population. It holds vast reserves of uranium, critical minerals including lithium and cobalt that are essential to the electric vehicle and battery storage industries, freshwater resources that will become increasingly strategically significant as climate change progresses, and forestry resources that supply global construction and paper industries. These are not peripheral assets. In a world grappling simultaneously with energy transition, food security, and the build-out of clean technology infrastructure, Canada's resource endowments position it at the intersection of virtually every major global economic challenge of the coming decades. Now, layer onto that resource foundation the institutional characteristics that make Canada an attractive partner for international investment and trade. Canada maintains a stable democratic government with strong rule of law an independent judiciary, a well-regulated financial system, and a track record of honoring its international commitments. In the current global environment, where supply chain security has become a paramount concern for governments and corporations across the developed world, these institutional characteristics carry enormous economic value. Businesses and governments seeking to diversify away from supply relationships that carry political or institutional risk place a significant premium on partners that combine resource abundance with institutional reliability. Canada fits that profile precisely. This is why the $4.7 billion in new trade deals should not be surprising to anyone who has been following the underlying economics carefully. European governments, accelerating their energy independent strategies in the aftermath of the Russia Ukraine conflict, have strong and growing incentives to deepen energy relationships with stable, democratic suppliers. Canada's liquefied natural gas potential, its hydroelectric capacity, and its critical mineral resources make it a natural partner for European energy security strategies. Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly India, are engaged in their own supply chain diversification efforts, reducing dependence on any single supplier or geographic concentration. Canadian commodities delivered through Pacific Coast infrastructure align directly with these strategic objectives. What Prime Minister Carney's trade deal announcements represent, therefore, is not simply a political response to American pressure. They represent the activation of latent economic relationships that were always available to Canada, but that had not been fully developed because the existing relationship with the United States was, under normal circumstances, sufficiently efficient and mutually beneficial to satisfy most of Canada's trade needs. The disruption created by the current trade tensions has, paradoxically, provided the catalyst for Canada to pursue a diversification agenda that strengthens its long-term economic position, regardless of how the bilateral relationship with the United States ultimately resolves. I want to address the inflation dimension of this dispute because it has direct relevance to the policy responsibilities I have carried throughout my career, and because I think it is insufficiently discussed in the context of the Canada-US trade tensions. Trade barriers are, at their economic core, a form of tax. When the United States imposes tariffs on Canadian goods, it raises the cost of those goods for American buyers, whether those buyers are consumers purchasing products at retail, manufacturers purchasing inputs for their production processes, or construction companies purchasing lumber and steel for their projects. These cost increases do not disappear into abstraction. They translate into higher prices across the American economy, contributing to inflationary pressure at precisely the moment when the Federal Reserve and the Treasury have worked hard to bring inflation back toward target levels following the extraordinary price pressures of the post-pandemic period. The irony of this dynamic should not be lost on anyone who has followed the political discourse around inflation over the past several years. The American public experienced significant hardship as a result of elevated inflation between 2021 and 2023. The political costs of that inflation were substantial and real, and yet the imposition of broad tariffs on a major trading partner, a trading partner whose goods are deeply embedded in the American consumer price basket, introduces upward pressure on prices that works directly against the goal of maintaining price stability. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a straightforward application of the economics of trade barriers that has been validated repeatedly throughout economic history. Consider the specific commodity categories most affected by the Canada-US trade tensions and their relevance to American consumer prices. Lumber, as I noted earlier, is a primary input into residential construction. The United States is experiencing a well-documented housing affordability crisis, driven in significant part by insufficient housing supply relative to demand. Tariffs on Canadian lumber raise the cost of home building, which raises home prices and rents, which exacerbates the affordability crisis that is causing genuine economic hardship for American families, particularly younger Americans, and those in lower income brackets who are most vulnerable to housing cost increases. The connection between Canadian lumber tariffs and American housing affordability is direct, quantifiable, and significant. Steel and aluminum follow a similar logic. These materials are inputs into a vast range of American manufacturing activities, automotive production, appliance manufacturing, infrastructure construction, energy sector development, and defense procurement. When the cost of these inputs rises due to tariff barriers on Canadian supplies, American manufacturers face a choice between absorbing the cost increase, which compresses margins and reduces competitiveness, or passing it through to customers in the form of higher prices. In competitive markets, the ability to absorb cost increases is limited, which means that tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum ultimately contribute to higher prices for American-made goods. This is not a hypothetical effect. It is a predictable and well-documented consequence of input cost increases. Energy deserves separate treatment because its macroeconomic significance is particularly large. Energy costs are, in economic terminology, a cost-push inflation factor. They affect the production costs of virtually every sector of the economy simultaneously. When energy prices rise, transportation costs increase, manufacturing costs increase, agricultural production costs increase, and household utility costs increase. The breadth of energy's influence on the price level means that disruptions to energy supply relationships carry outsized inflationary consequences relative to disruptions in more narrowly focused commodity categories. Canada is the largest single supplier of foreign energy to the United States. Any disruption to that supply relationship or any policy-induced uncertainty that causes Canadian energy producers to redirect investment and production toward alternative export channels has the potential to contribute meaningfully to American energy price pressures. I raise these inflationary dimensions not to assign political blame, but because I believe that honest economic analysis requires acknowledging the full cost structure of policy decisions. Trade barriers impose costs on both parties to a trade dispute. The costs are distributed differently and they manifest over different time horizons, but they are real and they are measurable. A complete accounting of the costs and benefits of the current trade posture toward Canada must include the inflationary effects on American consumers and businesses, effects that are, in my assessment, not receiving sufficient weight in the policy calculus. Let me now turn to the labor market implications of the Canada-US trade dispute, because employment effects are ultimately the most direct and personally felt consequences of trade policy for working Americans. The sectors most directly affected by tensions with Canada, energy, construction materials, metals manufacturing, and agriculture, are also sectors that employ millions of American workers, often in communities that have limited economic diversification and that depend heavily on the health of these specific industries.